And we're going to continue with the second chapter of The Figure in the Shadows by John Bellairs. Louis, Rosarita, Uncle Jonathan, and Mrs. Zimmerman have all gone through Grandpa Barnevelt's trunk, where they have now found a watch chain with a 3-cent piece attached to it that was the lucky piece of a comrade of Grandpa Barnevelt's during the Civil War. Louis looked at the coin and imagined it lying on a heap of money and swords and pistols in the red light of a campfire. He imagined Walter Finzer pulling a gun and shooting Grandpa Barnevelt. Blood had been shed because of that coin. Louis had read a lot, and he knew stories about kings who fought and killed each other over small objects. Small objects like crowns and jewels and pieces of gold. The coin seemed to Louis like something straight out of those old tales. Louis looked up at his Uncle Jonathan. Uncle Jonathan, are you sure this coin isn't magic? Sure as sure can be, Louis. But just to set your mind at ease, why don't you give it to Mrs. Zimmerman for a minute? She knows all about magic amulets and talismans and things of that kind. And I think she could probably tell just by the feel of the thing, couldn't you, Florence? Yes, I could. At my final exam at the University of Göttingen, when I was getting my doctor's degree in magic, I had to tell if certain objects were enchanted or not just by feeling them with my fingers. Here, let me see it. Louis handed the coin to Mrs. Zimmerman. She rubbed it back and forth between her fingers and stared at it thoughtfully for a few minutes. Then she handed it back to Louis. Sorry, Louis, she said, shaking her head. It just feels like a hunk of metal. If it were magic, it would kind of tingle in my hand. But there's nothing there. It's just an old coin. Louis held the coin up and looked at it sadly. Then he turned to Jonathan and said, Can I keep it? Jonathan blinked absent-mindedly. I said, can I keep it? Can you? Oh, sure. Go ahead, it's yours. Keep it as a souvenir of the Civil War. Jonathan patted Louis on the shoulder and smiled. Late that night, when Rosarita and Mrs. Zimmerman had gone home and Jonathan had gone to bed, Louis sat on the edge of his bed looking at the coin. It was too bad it wasn't magic. If it had been, it might have turned out to be one of those amulets that made you brave and strong and protected you from your enemies, like the pin that an ancient king of Ireland wore in his shirt when he went into battle. As long as he kept the pin on, he couldn't be wounded. Louis liked that story. He had never gone into battle with a sword and shield, but he had gotten into a few fistfights, and he had always lost them. Maybe if he had an amulet, he would have won those fights. Maybe if he had an amulet, Witty Mingo would not have been able to steal his hat. Oh well, thought Louis, that's the way it goes. He put the coin in the drawer of his bedside table, turned out the light, and went to bed. Louis went to bed, but he didn't go to sleep. He lay there tossing and turning and thinking about Woody and the Sherlock Holmes hat, and Grandpa Barnevelt and Walter Finzer, and the 3-cent coin. After that, he just lay there and listened to the sound of the house, the clock ticking, the bathtub faucet dripping, the various cracks and creaks and snaps that a big old house makes when it's settling itself for the night. Flip-flop. Louis sat up straight in his bed. He knew that sound. He knew it very well, but it was not a nighttime sound. It was the sound of the mail slot. The front door of Louis's house had a slot in it for mail. The slot had a hinged metal cover over it, and when the mailman lifted the cover to slide letters in, the cover went flip-flop. Louis and his uncle both loved to get mail, and no matter where they were in the house, when they heard the flip-flop sound, they came running. The mailman on their route was very talkative, and so seldom got to their house before 2:30 in the afternoon. But as far as Louis knew, the mail had never arrived at midnight. Louis sat there, wondering for a few minutes. Then he got out of bed, put on his slippers and bathrobe, and padded downstairs to the front hall. There on the floor, just below the mail slot, lay a postcard. Louis picked the card up and carried it over to the hall window. The gray light of a full moon was streaming in. It was bright enough to be read by, but there was nothing to read. The card was blank. Louis felt creepy. What kind of a message was this? He turned the card over and was relieved to find that the card was stamped and addressed, but the stamp looked very old-fashioned, and the postmark was so blurred that Louis couldn't tell where the card had been mailed from. The card was addressed in a neat curly-cued hand. Master Louis Barneveld, 100 High Street, New Zebedee, Michigan. There was no return address. Louis stood there in the moonlight, with the card in his hand. Maybe Rosarita had gotten up in the middle of the night to play him a practical joke. Maybe, but it didn't seem likely. Louis turned the card over and looked at the blank side again. His eyes opened wide. Now there was writing on the card. Venio. Louis's hand began to tremble. He had read about writing in invisible ink, but he had always heard that you had to dust a message with special powders or hold it over the fire to make the letters appear. This message had appeared all by itself, and Louis knew what the message said. He could read a little Latin, because he had been an altar boy once, and he knew what Venio meant. I come. Suddenly, Louis felt very afraid. He was afraid of being alone in the dark hallway. But as he stepped quickly across the hall to snap on the light, the card slipped out of his hand. It actually felt as if someone had grabbed it and pulled it away. Louis panicked and flung himself at the wall switch. Warm yellow light flooded the hallway of the old house. There was no one there, but the card was gone. And that's the end of Chapter 2.